our topic this evening is the problem of universals. So we are switching from where we often are talking about history, and we have been doing some theology lectures, and going now back to a philosophy topic. So let's try to state what the problem of universals is. So what color are these two oranges? So since this is philosophy, it must be a trick question, right? So the answer is they are orange, right? Oranges are orange. So if we observe these two orange circles that I have made in this slide, if we look at them closely, perhaps we see that they are both exactly the same color. So I actually copied and pasted the first circle to create the second circle. So how many colors are we seeing? So it turns out that there are two very different answers to that question. The first might be that we're just seeing one color. We're seeing the color orange. Both circles are one color. So even though we're seeing it twice, it's still the same color. It's only one color, orange. If we come to that answer, then the single color is a kind of entity that is repeatable. It can be found intact in both circles. So we're having a single entity, orange, and it is repeated in two instances that you can see right there, and it can be repeated in many more. There's plenty of things that can be orange. And so then, if that's the case, if that exists, that's what philosophers call a universal. And if that was your answer, then on the question of color in this particular instance, as I've framed it anyway, you would be, in this sense, what's called, the philosophers call, a realist. And we'll explain why that means you're a realist, because it's a weird name. It actually seems like it means the opposite thing. But anyway, you're a realist. So now let's start over. So if we think about it on reflection, isn't it true that there are actually two distinct colors here? So while the orangeness of the upper circle looks identical to the orangeness of the lower circle, in fact, the orange that's up there is actually just as completely distinct as the orange from the orange down at the bottom as the two circles are distinct. We're just using the same word to describe both different colors. The two colors that are there, we're using one word to describe them. And so if orange is just a word used to describe multiple particular colors, so everything that is orange is it's not orange, it's individual things which we are generalizing with the word orange to call them that, but they're in fact all different instances, then you would be a nominalist. Okay, so this is an ongoing philosophical fight, this is an open question. So the two views are actually central to the birth of the Western philosophical enterprise that begins with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. They remain current throughout the Middle Ages. So among the Abrahamic philosophers and theologians of the Middle Ages, which is to say the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian philosophers. And universals are still a problem in the present because there are still logical problems with both positions. It also, I'm going to suggest, is a high-stakes question, and we'll kind of see why through the course of this lecture, why I brought it up, why I wanted to take the time to present this to all of you, and also, for me, why I wanted to put this on my calendar and deadline list of something that I wanted to study and get a better handle on, which is one of the reasons I picked these lecture topics, in addition to anticipating or answering requests from the different people who have been watching in the audience. So the problem of universals has some implications for foundational philosophical issues. Whenever we talk about philosophy, it's a lot easier for me to come, because my background training is as a historian, so it is a lot easier for me to come at everything from a historical perspective or a historian's perspective. philosophy is just filled with technical terminology that is like a foreign language that has to always be translated, and we want to, and I want to, in understanding it myself and also trying to make it more accessible to a general audience, always just define those. But we can't avoid some of these terms because philosophers are just constantly using these terms. So one of these philosophical issues that's at the ground, the foundation, is ontology. That's what philosophers call it. And so that is the nature of being or existence. So ontology is studying what does it mean, what does existence mean, what does being mean. And then epistemology, which is the study of how we actually know anything or learn things. And so it's also the problem of universals affects not only both of those, but also metaphysics, which is everything that is beyond physics. And there's even a bunch of logical implications because the problem of universals was tied up with Aristotle's formulation of logic, and Western logic has its basis initially in Aristotelian logic. So let's look at those ontological questions for realism, the questions about being. So if the realists are correct, so we talked about this, so realists are the folks that are saying that there are universals, that universals have some metaphysical reality. If realists are correct, and orangeness is something that exists in some metaphysical sense, there are some serious ontological questions, in other words, questions about being or existence that have to be settled. So, like, how do universals exist? Where do they exist? Does orangeness exist apart from any particular thing that is orange? So if so, how and where? How many qualities are universal? So is, red is a universal and yellow is, and orange is kind of a mix between those two. Are there all of these other universals that are gradations like yellow orange and red orange and so forth? So for people who are committed to philosophical realism, the idea that that universals are real, there's a lot of these metaphysical and existence questions that have to be explained. By contrast, if you're a nominalist, if you're suggesting that that color or any of these things that we're calling a universal, that they don't actually exist, that these are just a name that we give to things and we're simply generalizing, and there is nothing that is actually orange. There's just every little thing that is its own color, and we call them all orange by a generalization. So if you are a nominalist who is saying that, you have a different problem of explaining, and that is this epistemological problem. How do we know anything? Considering almost all knowledge is about generalizing a concept, like a humanity, or an orange, or a color. Those are all generalizations, but if those generalizations are have no reality to them and are simply, let's say, a false category or an ultimately arbitrary category, there's a question of how do we actually know anything? Aren't these categories arbitrary, and aren't they ultimately non-reflective of what actual reality is? So is there a way to know things if we reduce everything down to this particularism? So, the word orange is a generalization. If there are no oranges, there's only individual objects that we call oranges because we're making a generalization. again, then they're only individual distinct objects with different qualities, and that we're lumping them together somewhat arbitrarily. And there are things that we do that nominally for. So for example, berries. There's all different kinds of berries that are not related to each other in any kind of way, and we are lumping them together in groups arbitrarily, and biologists or botanists are trying to get us to redefine what berries are so that whatever, strawberries aren't berries and bananas are berries and that kind of thing, things that don't make a lot of sense to us, but have more of a biological or botanical sense. Okay, so that was already a lot of complex terms, and they're sort of alien to me, and they may be a little alien to you if you were generally watching these lectures week after week, because most often what we've been doing lately are sort of, let's say, deep dives into biblical characters. Who was Mary Magdalene? Or apocryphal texts. Let's look at the Gnostic Gospels or something. So if you've come for those, why should you stay here and hear painful words like ontology and epistemology and others like that, nominalism and realism? Well, I'm going to suggest that this has a major impact for people who are interested in biblical topics. So in the book of Exodus, when Moses asks God's name, the reply from the burning bush is, "I am that I am." You shall say, "I am has sent you." So this is an identification of God with being itself. So ontology is the study of being and existence. And the same phrase essentially is being referenced from Exodus in the Gospel of John by Jesus in the various "I am" sayings, when Jesus teaches things like, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. Way, the truth, and the light. I am the bread, the bread of life," and so forth. All of the "I am" sayings. He has 7 "I am" sayings, where he is, by referencing that statement from the burning bush, Jesus in the Gospel of John is saying that I am God in that way, and so it is a part of the that Christian theological understanding of God as Trinity. So traditionally then, from those kinds of sayings, from the Exodus saying and from the Gospel of John sayings, Christian theologians identify God as being itself, beings for being's sake. So existence, for existence's own sake, which is to say, like, say, a form or of being, or the eternal concept of being. And so both the source of all being that exists and everything that exists, and being itself. So that is traditionally an identification that Christian theologians have with God. So ontology and what being is really important. And also in previous lectures, so when we had the lecture just a couple weeks ago on divine wisdom and the Logos, we saw how God in the Bible is identified with wisdom, and so that is another potential universal, the universal of wisdom, which is seen as a hypostasis with God, so a way to understand God. And we have others of those that are in Scripture. So for example, the first epistle of John makes the statement that God is love. And so again, there's this universal concept of love, and God is equated with that in Scripture. And Christians frequently identify God with other words or ideals, eternal ideals if they're ideals, so with universals such as goodness, and justice, righteousness, and even veracity, truth. So whether or not those ideas or universals, or just if they exist as anything other than just words, that has metaphysical relevance for Christians, and actually just everybody in Abrahamic religions, and really everybody who's interested in the divine. So it's a question for that. But certainly it's within the traditional context of what we talk about here on the lectures. So we mentioned here, epistemology then is how do we know what we know? How can we know what we know? So epistemology should also be important to people interested in biblical topics. So Christians identify God with truth, and so it's important to know, well, what is truth? As Pontius Pilate asks Jesus in the Gospel of John, Riley or Coyley. It's also important to know how can we know what's true? So epistemology, how do we know what we know? And indeed, if Christians believe that God is truth, then coming to know truth is coming to know God. And knowing God is one of the goals of Christian life. So is there such a thing as truth? Or are there only competing narratives that are important from an individual's relative perspective? Is there such a thing as goodness, a universal concept of goodness? Or is everything just good relative to other things from different perspectives? So this is also an important question for these same theological, philosophical, even religious reasons. I mentioned that often philosophy can be really hard to approach and filled with all kinds of jargon terms, and there's some other problems too. But I want to highlight this resource. So Peter Adamson is a philosopher and a historian of philosophy who has written this amazing and detailed and long and just also very accessible and approachable series of books called A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And this has just been reading for me for the last couple of years as I've kind of gotten the whole series. The medieval philosophy one is just my favorite. I love that book. It's just filled with so much, because normally all of this stuff gets overlooked, or it's very technical. If you have other, let's say, a general survey course on the history of philosophy, and they'll start with the pre-Socratics and then have Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They'll have one chapter of everybody that came after them, and then they'll just give like a shout out to Augustine and Aquinas, and then they'll jump straight to Descartes, and we get to essentially the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and modern philosophy. And so almost the whole of Hellenistic and Greco-Roman philosophy, medieval philosophy, early modern, early modern is usually talked about, but anyway, medieval philosophy especially, those all get omitted normally, other than just, like I say, a little bit of talking about Aquinas and maybe Anselm and Augustine. Adamson's work is really amazing because he really gets into so many everybody in between, and shows how this is actually a conversation that's ongoing, and when you jump, you miss all of the things that informed all of the people that we're getting to when you make the jump to. So Descartes is not talking only, to Plato and Aristotle. He's talking to all of the people who were immediately before him that we are jumping across. All right. So let's start back at the beginning with those pre-Socratics and then Socrates. So when the city-state of Athens developed into an ancient democracy, and so it starts to be governed by an assembly that is made up of all free adult male citizens, so less than a third of the population, but nevertheless a much more inclusive kind of government than what had happened before with oligarchies or different kinds of monarchies, autocracies. When that happens in the 6th century, suddenly there develops a market for politicians who are persuasive speakers. So we even get the word politician from the Greek word for city, polis, and politics and political all comes out of the activities now that are happening in these, polites, in these Greek city-states. And so there is a major incentive. If you could be a persuasive speaker, suddenly it's a lot easier to be a leader. It's not something that you were either born to, or you were the maybe won because you're the best, strongest fighter or something like that. Or I always think it's always fun that the quality that they list for Saul when he's going to be the first king of the Israelites is that he's a head taller than everybody else, and so that's like the standout quality. He had a lot of other faults apparently, but anyway, that was something that maybe was one of the things that qualified him, other than God picking him at first. But so in this case now, being able to get people to vote for you, suddenly that, so public speaking becomes an important thing. And so now there's also a market for maybe, how can you maybe be taught to do that? Maybe that's a skill you can learn and develop. And if you get that to work, you can vote contracts to something that you own. You could become potentially a lot richer and more powerful. And so it's something that you might be willing to pay a lot for to develop that skill. So as a result, there emerged a class of teachers who had the ability to train pupils in that art of public speaking, and they were able to command a premium, a lot of money. The teachers became known as sophists. And so that comes from the Greek word for wise man, sophist, and so it initially has the connotation, just wise men, or people who are training you in wisdom. But because much of what they're doing comes to be looked on, let's say, disparagingly, sophist ends up having a negative connotation attached to it. So the sophist included in their training, for example, the ability to argue both sides of any issue. And let's say you happen to be on the issue that it's a weaker argument. Maybe it doesn't advance the interests of the city the way the opposing argument does, but what if you could make it sound like your way was better? You might still get the votes, even though you have the weaker argument. And so because it seemed to be a distortion potentially of truth, sophistry took on this meaning of dishonesty, or just like make rhetorical tricks. And indeed, Socrates' own student, Alcibiades, was able to use his considerable rhetorical skills to become what we call a demagogue. So a guy who is able to sweet talk the Democrats, the Democratic populace, in order to get votes where they maybe vote against their interests, and he successfully got people to fund an invasion of Sicily that ultimately was devastating for the Athenian state and eventually caused the democracy to collapse and so forth. So it was a major error, but people all voted for it. So looking at these sophists, they also, though, so even though their enemies didn't consider the sophists to be philosophers, the fragments that we have of their teachings show that they actually were providing philosophical arguments for what they're doing. So one of the most successful sophists, a guy named Protagoras, he was criticized, later remembered criticized by Aristotle, for claiming to be able to teach students how to make weak arguments appear stronger. But Protagoras seems to have justified some of this philosophically. So he is a forerunner of a kind of relativism. So we have a quote from him: "Man is the measure of all things, of the things that they are, of the things that are not, that they are not." And so that's pretty famous still to say man is the measure of all things. That's come down to us. What does it mean? It might mean that every individual perspective is its own standard. We can't step outside and have some kind of universal perspective where we can judge truth and false. Rather, everything is relative to your individual perspective, which is why Protagoras then could justify that he teaches his students how to argue both sides of any given topic in order to show that really what we're trying to accomplish here is rhetorical skills, and the truth is really only relative if there is truth. Another great sophist, a guy named Gorgias, had another challenge to epistemology. How do we know things? So he argued in the first place that there really isn't an essential meaning to anything. So on this question of, how can you be like teaching both sides of an argument? You're teaching people to, perniciously scoff the truth, because obviously the truth is going to be on one side and not the other. And he says, well, there's no essential truth to anything if everything is seen relatively. But even if there were an essential truth to something, that truth would be unknowable to human beings. It would be something that is beyond us and that we wouldn't have any means of gaining knowledge of that because we wouldn't be able to grasp that. So let's say the God or the gods does have truth or is truth. That truth is too removed for us to be able to participate in it. And then 3, even if somebody were to actually be able to participate in it, if it was able to be known by some guy, the wisest guy, it still wouldn't be able to be communicated to others because language doesn't have any intrinsic meaning and it is too imprecise to communicate actual knowledge. Every person hears words differently, every person interprets things, and so the actual essential meaning would always be lost. So these arguments challenge the idea that there's such a thing then as meaning or truth in the first place, and even beyond that, then can we know it and could we communicate it? So the ideas of the sophists were part of the immediate context of Socrates, who took what they were saying very seriously and also took up their challenge. And really his response ended up founding the Western philosophical tradition. That's not Socrates' only context. He's also responding to the emerging pre-Socratic philosophical tradition that has come before him of people questioning causation and natural processes, questioning traditional myths and trying to come up with, in some cases, naturalistic explanations for natural processes. So that's also a backdrop of Socrates, but Socrates is especially interested in, as opposed to those natural philosophical questions, these kind of more personal philosophical questions about what is virtue? Is there such a thing as virtue? And so Socrates took ideas like that, virtue or beauty, truth, very seriously, and he developed an inquiry style where he attempts to find meaning by asking people that he comes and meets on the street and he has a dialogue with, or he's at a dinner party with. He asks them for definitions. What is virtue? How do you live a virtuous life? And then when somebody says what their base assumption is, how they define that, what they think that means, then Socrates proceeds to follow up with further questions, and sort of inevitably he ends up identifying logical inconsistencies that the person has and maybe false assumptions that the person has in order to try to get closer to an actual answer, even if it doesn't maybe achieve that actual answer. It's the Socratic method of seeking wisdom. Socrates himself left no writings. He actually did not think that you could do his process of Socratic dialogue through writing, because that would would freeze the discussion. It freezes the dialogue instead of having it be something where you're continually having a living discussion like he was doing. Nevertheless, his student Plato didn't feel that way, and instead attempted to create a literary or written form of doing what Socrates did. So he created Platonic dialogues where in a lot of cases the character in it is Socrates, and Plato is attempting to write a kind of a discussion that Socrates would have had with his contemporaries. And that these start out to be more probably at the earliest parts of Plato's career, more like what maybe Socrates was actually saying. And then over time, it develops into, as Plato himself ages and becomes a very sophisticated thinker and develops his own ideas, maybe it's more Plato saying what he would say, or what he is now saying Socrates is saying as a character. And so we get more Plato as it goes along. And so Plato, in the course of these, provides essentially the first answer to this problem of universals. So are there universals? And that is with his major theory, the theory of the forms, or ideals. So Plato argues that immaterial ideas, universals here, things like justice, truth, and beauty, so that those are immaterial. They don't have a material existence that you can touch and sense. But in contrast to those things that we can touch and sense in the material world, those ideas are eternal and unchanging. And as a result of that, whereas everything in the world, all of this physical matter, is in a constant state of decay, and it was here today and it'll be gone tomorrow. And as a consequence, these eternal immaterial ideas are, Plato argues, more real than anything that could be found in the sensible material world, the world that we can just sense with our five senses. And so this is where this word realism comes from, where we're talking about people who are asserting that universals have reality to them, and that's why it's called realism. I've always, like I say, found that to be, since the philosophical or metaphysical argument that ideas are more real than the physical world around us seems so backwards, that seems unrealistic. And so the fact that philosophy is called realism is always maybe a little counterintuitive, but that's what we mean by realism. So for Plato, these forms, these eternal ideas, are not just conceptions that are in our minds. They're actually objective realities that are not visible to the eye of the body. In other words, they're not sensible. They're not part of our senses. But they're only, you can only appreciate them through the eye of the mind, which means that they're intelligible or intellectible as opposed to sensible. The mental eye that sees in this non-physical way the forms, it's not just simply reasoning or brain activity. Rather, intelligibility is a perception employing intellectual intuition and contemplation. And so Plato's philosophy is highly spiritualized. And I've argued before that even though in modern terms, because we have these very modern Western specific ideas of what is religion and what is not religion, of the secular and the religious world, and philosophy has escaped over into the secular world because there's a very strict cordon of what constitutes religion anymore. That isn't true at all in medieval and pre-modern times, or indeed anywhere around the world outside of the West that created that idea, which again, maybe Brian's going to talk about next week in the We're All Protestants lecture. As a result of that we should see in antiquity, people like Plato are actually religious reformers who are talking to the traditional polytheists' neighbors who are participating in old cult rituals and myths and so on to understand the world, that philosophy here is attempting to reform those religious ideas. So in order to teach his theory of the forms, Plato has this very famous allegory of the cave, where in the allegory, all of the things that we can sense and touch in the material world, those are analogized to essentially a shadow puppet show that prisoners chained in a dimly lit cave are seeing projected against a wall. And that, let's say, that shadow of the true reality, the immaterial reality of the spiritual forms, the eternal forms, is as different as if any of those prisoners then escaped the cave and saw the actual light of the sun. And so this is the contrast between the sensible world and the intellectual world according to Plato. And really, this is ever more. This was a hard concept to maybe grasp, a couple thousand years ago when we didn't have all of these screens and all of the different kinds of ways that we are able to experience, non-reality or surreality. So obviously, there's been much more exploration of these kinds of analogies, with movies like The Matrix and so on. If there's how much is the real world around us real? So things in the material world, according to Plato's realism, are participating imperfectly in the forms, in the eternal ideas. So behind these individual material oranges, there are the immaterial ideas. So the oranges are participating in orangeness, which is to say the orangeness that is the perfect eternal template of the fruit. But they're also participating in the form of orangeness, the color, the perfect color. And these oranges are participating perhaps even less perfectly in the form of sphericity, which exists as a sphere. It only exists as a mathematical perfection metaphysically and immaterially, but nowhere in reality, because the earth is not a perfect sphere. It is a material sphere that is participating imperfectly in sphericity. So all of those forms exist in a way that is more real metaphysically because it's unchanging and perfect, according to Plato. So there are critiques of this right in Plato's own life. So we've had a lecture before on the ancient Cynics and their kind of leader or founder of their school, Diogenes of Sinope. So Diogenes actually emulated another one of Socrates' students. So Plato is the most famous of Socrates' students, but there were, other guys who went in other directions. Well, we mentioned Alcibiades, who was a student of Socrates, who went on to be a politician and a demagogue. Another writer like Plato is a guy named Xenophon, who has a very different perspective on Socrates. And Socrates' student Antisthenes is also had a different take on Plato, and so he adopted an asceticism, which is to say, it's the same kind of thing where Plato is less interested in materialism and is more interested in ideas. But Antisthenes here then, by being an ascetic, is also saying, well, we shouldn't be focusing on the body. We should be, eschewing like luxuries. We should be focusing on the things that are eternal. And then Diogenes took that a way further by eliminating things like ownership of property. So he lives in a barrel famously, and he has just a cup for his begging and drinking. And then when he sees that a kid was able to drink water just using his hand as a cup, he realized that he'd had way too much material stuff, and he got rid of the cup because he's now able to just drink with his hand. He does things according to how he understands, like you should live in nature without having all kinds of excessive stuff. And he also does a little bit of what Socrates did, in terms of Socrates would come and have arguments with people and bug them about maybe truths that they didn't want to explore, But Diogenes takes that up to like being performance art. So he's holding here a lantern. He walks around with a lit lantern in the marketplace, and people ask, "Why are you doing that? What was that before?" And he's saying he's looking for now I'm not even remembering his story, but anyway, it's performance art. He's looking for a wise man, I guess, or is what he's looking for, something like that. As I'm trying to remember what the exact thing that Diogenes did here is, but so he's doing performance art in order to humiliate people, or to get them to think and to rethink their lifestyles and all of the things that they think, the worldly things that they're doing that they think are important. And so Plato called that Socrates gone mad. So he could see that the roots of what Socrates was doing and what Diogenes and the Cynics are doing, but he thinks that it's now lost any sane bearing. Nevertheless, Diogenes also is critical of Plato's core theory here. So his critique of Plato's theory of the forms is, well, I've seen Plato's cups and table, but not his cupness and tableness. And so the argument here is that essentially, I appreciate that Plato is trying to argue that unsensible things that you can't sense, are more real than the things that you can sense, but I don't sense those things, is essentially the nominalist rebuttal. So Plato had a great student, Aristotle, who also is critical of his teacher's theory of forms. So while Plato extrapolated from geometry and other kinds of mathematics, so when you are focusing on things like that, when you were thinking of, like say, a geometrically perfect point which occupies no space and is totally immaterial, or a line that is infinite in all directions and is perfectly straight, these are not things that you can actually draw or create. They are a mathematical idea that is perfect, that it can only be, let's say, replicated by drawing a symbolic example of it, or drawing an imperfect example of it. You can't actually create a perfect sphere, even though mathematically they function in a perfect way. So that, because Plato is so taken with those kind of ideas, you can see where that maybe led to his thinking of the forms, from that basis, extrapolating that to all things. So Aristotle, by contrast, really focused his study on nature, and is one of the great originators of natural philosophy, which is what is essentially the ancient and medieval word for science. And for example, Aristotle becomes the first philosopher to study biology systematically. He's the founder or father of a dozen different sciences, as he is really interested in systemization, and he is interested in a kind of a early version anyway of empiricism, where he is looking at things from his sensory experience, quite in contrast to Plato, who's dismissing the sensible world. Aristotle thinks, no, this is really, we can actually get somewhere if we pay attention to our senses and do that systematically, and we start to create categories, and Aristotle is really good at all that. So Aristotle, in terms of universals, comes up with a revision to Plato's realism that is, though, a compromise. He doesn't go to nominalism. He instead has what's called eminent realism, or a realism that actually exists in the sensible world. So if we take on the left here kind of Plato's conception, material things, so the oranges that we might pick up and touch and eat, those exist in the kind of grubby material world, the imperfect material world, and they come into existence and they decompose, or we eat them and they're gone. They, though, are all participating in an ideal form of the orange that is unchanging and eternal and perfect. So Aristotle is like, well, there is such a thing as a form, but that overlaps with matter. So when you take matter and you give it a particular form, that's what makes something become a thing. And so this is especially obvious with human-made stuff. So I have a podium here that's made of wood. And so this is experiencing, this is a material thing in Plato's idea that is experiencing, participating in the ideal podium, which is a form of a podium, which has a metaphysical reality outside from this imperfect representation of podiumness that is not, that this is simply a participant in. Aristotle's like, nah, what happens is you take material, wood, and you give it a form of a podium, and then that's what makes a thing. So the form then goes from being metaphysically independent to being a cause for the way a certain thing is. And so it becomes from a form to what sometimes Aristotle calls the formal cause of why a thing is the way it is, and that goes along with his other causes of what makes a thing things. So Aristotle's concept then requires objects require both form and matter. And like I say, well, Plato argues that perfect forms like goodness or good, they're real and they exist immaterially, even if they're not found in the sensible world. So nothing is perfectly good anywhere in the sensible world that we'll find. Some things experience some goodness, or they're a little good, or they're partially good, but nothing is good like the form of good. Aristotle, his kind of moderate realism, requires the form to exist materially within a thing for it to exist. And he is especially dubious of Plato's really important form of good, because he thinks there's just too many different things that we mean when we call something good for that to be a independent metaphysical form. So this becomes a kind of moderate realism. So while Aristotle offered a bunch of very serious critiques of Plato's theory of forms, he nevertheless comes down on the realist side of this nominalist-realist debate in the problem of universals. So sometimes people have characterized all of philosophy as a footnote to Plato, or that philosophy is a swing back and forth between Platonism and Aristotelianism. But I actually think that that is a thing that's going on, but actually there's a bigger conversation between the people who are kind of on the same team, which is Plato and Aristotle, and then the sophists. And there's actually an argument that is going back and forth historically between that, and the sophists are on the nominalist side, and both Plato and Aristotle are on the realist side of this debate in terms of the problem of universals. So while Aristotle rejects the idea that universals have an existence independent of matter, he still accepts the existence of universals within those material things. So that's a kind of moderate realism. So let's fast forward this as we want to get this into the Middle Ages. So while the ruling class of the Roman Empire that inherited all of this classical Greek philosophy, the Romans, who were Latin speakers, conquered the Greeks, but also militarily, but they also then found so much of Greek culture to be intriguing and sophisticated, and they, their elite largely adopted lots of it, although changing it. When the Western Empire, though, collapsed, when the different Germanic kingdoms, essentially Germanic confederations that had been serving as mercenaries in the West Roman army, when they took over and started to rule the state as Germanic kingdoms, suddenly there was a lot less. The state contracts really rapidly. There's a lot less time for the elite to be doing things like being literate in Greek. They have a lot of other worries, and the bilingualism becomes bilingual in Latin, and then whatever the Germanic conquerors' language is, Gothic of different kinds. So at the end of all that, right during this transition, there's a Christian scholar, Boethius. We've had a whole lecture on his book, The Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius was a Roman from Italy who becomes essentially the chief civil officer in the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, functionally like the prime minister to the king, Theodoric the Great. He is still the heir, though, to all of this classical learning. He knows Greek. He's very familiar with both Plato and especially Aristotle. And he is an advocate of Aristotle and planned actually to translate his complete works into Latin. He got the project started, but unfortunately he did not get that project finished because he was ultimately denounced by somebody in the court, accused of treason. The king arrested him, imprisoned him, and ultimately executed him. While he was in prison, he wrote his masterpiece, this little book called The Consolation of Philosophy, one of the most influential works in Western literature. But unfortunately, the bulk of his Aristotle translation project was left unfinished, and the texts and the bulk of Aristotle actually made their way to medieval Latin thinkers via Arabic philosophers and theologians. And so there's a great height and period of early medieval Muslim philosophy that has its flowering a couple centuries before, in the centuries immediately before universities and thought really have a early central medieval Renaissance in the Latin West. And so I was also pointing out, I was showing before the history without any gaps. I have another resource here that I very much recommend. It's very, very technical, though. Paul Vincent Spade has 5 texts on the medieval problem of universals. He gathers together and translates the main primary sources. So Porphyry, Boethius, Peter Abelard, Duns Scotus, and then William of Ockham. And I wanted to pull from all of those. I ended up not having time to create slides from everything. When I when I do these on history topics, it's a lot easier for me to go a lot faster and make slides mostly out of my head. I have to look up a lot more stuff and be much more confident with what I'm doing and the terminology when I'm using the second language of philosophy. So I'll give you a flavor for some of this as we'll talk about Porphyry and Boethius and then William of Ockham today. So among the texts that Boethius he actually did finish translating from Aristotle were Aristotle's Categories, his book on interpretation, his book of prior analytics, his book on topics, and his book Sophistical Refutations. And so this is kind of the core of Aristotelian logic. And so medieval thinkers in the Latin West did have access to all of this component of Aristotle, and that actually formed their framework for medieval logic. So that part was saved. In terms of Plato, actually very little of Plato got translated directly, and so medieval people also didn't have, other than there's just one partially translated dialogue, the Timaeus, that they had. But because important Christian thinkers like Augustine had so fully swallowed up Platonism via the Neoplatonists into Christian thought, that Platonism was kind of the dominant idea in the early and central Middle Ages, that they're just getting it indirectly through Augustine. They had very little Aristotle, and it's only when Aristotle starts getting recovered initially via the Muslim philosophers, that changes things. So this is the beginning of that, though, when Boethius still hasn't. So Boethius did give everybody this Aristotelian logic. And in addition, he translated an isagoge, an introduction to Aristotle's Categories by a Neoplatonist philosopher named Porphyry. And so Porphyry includes in his commentary on Aristotle here 3 open questions about universals. And then because he didn't answer the questions, then everybody who read this commentary felt like, oh, well, I'm going to try to answer those questions. And so when you have an authority that tells you the answers, you're less likely to dispute them, or you have to go through the effort of disputing them. In this case, it was an open question. And so Porphyry writes, I shall omit to speak about genera and species. I'm going to omit to speak about universals, is what he's actually kind of meaning here, as to whether they subsist. So do they really exist in the nature of things, or are they mere conceptions only? So do universals exist, or are they real, or are they conceptions only? Whether also, if subsistent, they are bodies or incorporeal, and whether they are separate from or in sensibles and subsist about these. For, I'm not going to talk about that, he's saying, because such a treatise is most profound and requires another more extensive investigation. So he just is saying he's going to leave that for somebody else or for a later book. So if we rephrase those 3 questions of Porphyry, he's asking, are universals real, like Plato said, or are they merely conceptions, like the nominalists say? If they are real, are they material or immaterial? If they are immaterial, do they exist within material bodies of objects or separately from them? And so those are the questions. And actually Boethius, who is a very smart guy, he points out that actually Porphyry, even though he's saying he isn't going to tell you what his thinks are, he thinks that, well, Porphyry is actually betraying his actual position, even though he says he isn't. Because if you believe universals aren't real, you don't need to ask if they are immaterial. But you've already answered the first question, are they real or are they just conceptions? Well, he's saying they're real. So now they're real. Are they material or immaterial? And then if you say, now, if they are immaterial, then you're actually answering the second question. So if you believe they're material, you don't need to ask if they exist within objects. So Paul Vincent Spade, who's the author of this book, he rephrases Boethius' definition of a universal, bringing into it some modern examples anyway. He says a universal is something common to or shared by several things, as a whole, not part by part, as a pie is shared by all who takes a slice. So it's not just taking parts of a pie. That's not what a universal is, that we're all experiencing the pie. We are getting it, when we are participating in pie, we're getting it whole, simultaneously, not in succession, as a used car is possessed wholly by all of its owners, but only one after another. So in other words, it's not something that it's simultaneous. It's not temporal that way. And the universal is it in such a way as it enters into the metaphysical makeup of what it is common to. So there's something metaphysical going on ontologically in terms of the being of the thing that is participating in the universal, in orangeness or something like that. Not merely, for example, the external way as at a sporting event, which is wholly and simultaneously present to all of its spectators. So everybody who's spectating is seeing that sporting event, but they're just participating in it externally. They're not making up the event. So if these exist, so if all of those things exist, that's again, that's saying that universals are real, and that means you're a realist. If these things don't have any real existence, if they're just a concept, if it's just a name or a generalization, then that means you're a nominalist, as Boethius frames it here. Boethius, in addition to that definition that is now going to be used by all of the later thinkers in the Middle Ages, Boethius also preserved for the West a limited definition of universals from Aristotle, because he translated this in Aristotle's On Interpretation. He translated this into Latin. So this is one of the few things that survives. So Aristotle says, among things, some are universal while others are singular. By universal, I mean what is apt to be predicated of many. By singular, what is not apt to be predicated of many. For example, humanity, is a universal, whereas Callias, Pete, is singular. So there is a singular guy in instance of a Pete, whereas humanity is a universal, not a singular thing. So predication here, so we have subject and predicate in a sentence. If you ever had to do that in grammar, you'd mark the subject and then the predicate of a sentence. And so predication in philosophy is when a property is subsumed into the subject. So if we say the famous syllogism, all men are mortal, or part of a leg of the syllogism, all men are mortal. So then the property mortal is predicated of the subject man. So there is a philosophical predication in that. So if Aristotle, in talking about predication that way, if he's just talking about something that's linguistic, so if we're just saying that some terms can be predicated of many things, but it really doesn't have any meaning other than a linguistic meaning, then that's nominalism. But if there is a philosophical, metaphysical predication, if that quality is actually metaphysically being attached to or subsumed into that subject, then that is again realism. And so those are definitions that all of the later medieval thinkers are working from. And so, if Boethius's interpretation of Porphyry answering the questions as he did by making those three, as a Neoplatonist, Porphyry might have been wanting to synthesize Plato and Aristotle, but by tilting the scale back towards Plato and Plato's idea of the forms. One of the things that Neoplatonists are doing, Neoplatonists are heirs of Platonism in the following centuries after Plato, and one of the whole enterprises that they have to do is account for all of Aristotle's objections. And so when you're doing that, though, they often are trying to bring Aristotle into greater harmony with Plato, which is part of the philosophical enterprise in Antiquity and through the Middle Ages. So by contrast, in his own answers to Porphyry, Boethius stays closer to Aristotle. You can see that he wants to translate all of Aristotle into Latin. He is more Aristotelian and more in that school than Neoplatonist. And so he argues for, again, a moderate realism like Aristotle did, where universals, they're not just mere concepts, but they also don't have this immaterial metaphysical existence outside of material objects the way they do in Plato for Boethius. So, would like to give you a bunch more examples like that, but effectively what we'll just say is Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, they all develop different moderate realist positions. They are all dealing with the synthesis of, competition between Platonism and Aristotelianism. Some of them, like Aquinas, are tilting much more in favor of Aristotle. Some of them, like Bonaventure, are much more in favor of Plato. But they all continue to be realists, but moderate realists on some level of the scale. A contrast to that, then, is Peter Abelard, who we have had a whole lecture on with him and his student Eloise, who was also very brilliant. Abelard pioneered a kind of nominalism. And then Abelard's formulation and the cause of nominalism is then really championed by a character named William of Ockham, who is very famous because of his association with Occam's razor. So we'll just look at William of Ockham as our main proponent or example of nominalism. So born at the end of the 13th century, probably in a little town southwest of London, Ockham. William was raised as a Franciscan, probably given as a boy as an oblate. So sometimes families, when they have a miracle baby, they give that baby to the monastery, and the kid is raised from early age on. And the church often tried to stop that practice because it was, I don't know, I think it was seen as, you're not able to make your own decision at that age about whether you're having a true religious conversion. But sometimes when they did that and they go to they go so early into a religious school, this is where all the schools were, you can more naturally speak Latin because you're learning it so young. You can become more brilliant by studying so much earlier than other people who are joining later in life. So William of Ockham became very brilliant. He was trained as a scholastic philosopher and became one of the most influential thinkers of the Middle Ages. So he popularized the principle of parsimony, although the name Occam's razor is a modern name for, so William of Ockham didn't use the word razor, for this principle of parsimony. So do I have it here what that is? But so the principle of parsimony is all things being equal, it's better to have fewer, the simplest explanation is the better. So we don't need to have large, complex ways of describing something. It's much better to have the simplest explanation for that is to be preferred. So Ockham takes that principle of parsimony, Occam's razor, to all of the very complicated metaphysical constructs that have been proposed by the moderate realists who came before him. And so he just more or less answers these questions from Porphyry and Boethius's definition, Aristotle's definitions, by saying, there is no universal outside the mind really existing in individual substances or in the essences of things. So denying right there that universals have a real existence. They're just something that's in our mind, a mental generalization that we're making. And the reason he gives for that is everything that is not many things is necessarily one thing in number and is consequently a singular thing. So it's going back to that idea of predication, and he's saying logically it doesn't work to have to multiply these things and have multiple existences of orangeness in all of these things. So rather than participating in universals as understood by the realists, Ockham here is arguing that qualities like orangeness are simply names. So in Latin, the word names is nomina, and this is what gives us nominalism, the name of nominalism for this philosophical position. So Ockham's rejection of universals and of Plato's forms ultimately has the effect of reviving the first of those arguments by Gorgias. Nothing has any essential meaning. We don't have inside anything, as he was saying, there's no essential meaning that's part of it. This is simply an object, and anything that we're having is a mental generalization where we're describing that object. So we can talk about individual oranges and their qualities without multiplying metaphysical categories, orangeness, sphericity, all of these things to describe it. We just can talk about an orange and its qualities as far as Ockham is concerned. And everything else is slid off metaphysically because of the razor. So while nominalism has had very serious consequences for philosophy, it's not, the pendulum very much has swung in that way, although it is not a closed question, I'll say. Was not able to also get past the Middle Ages and to show where people are in modern times, but there's definitely an open debate. I also, though, want to consider some of the implications of William of Ockham's philosophy for theology, because those also had effects that are still with us in Christianity. So whereas, and also I think in Islam too, but anyway, whereas Augustine had synthesized Platonism and Christian theology by equating God with Plato's form of the good, and indeed by housing Plato's forms, Plato's ideas. Where are all those ideas? Well, Augustine has a place for them. They're in the mind of God. So nominalism gets rid of all of this metaphysical excesses, and there's no forms, and so they don't need to be in God's mind or anywhere because they don't exist. So what is good then? So for Christian theologians, from Augustine and Boethius to Anselm and Aquinas, there's really no question that God's various commandments, things like love your enemies, those are good because they equated God with the Platonic universal of good. So God is good, and God always chooses good, as far as Anselm and Aquinas are concerned, because that's God's essence and essential nature. So, but for Ockham, goodness is not a universal. It's a quality that God has willed. So we've gotten rid of all of these extra metaphysical universals, and instead we just have objects and qualities. So we have God and the qualities God wills. However, because God is omnipotent, God could have willed to make anything to be good. So in Ockham's view, God is omnipotent, and asserting that he does or commands various things because they're inherently good, that would imply limits to what God could do. If like Anselm is more or less saying that God only ever does good because that's God's essence, that really is a limitation on God's free will, according to Ockham. Instead, Ockham argues that God commands and does things, those are just nominally, they're called good, it's nominalism, because God has willed them, and so then we call them good. And so the theology that pulls out of this, this philosophy is called voluntarism, from the Latin word for will, because it is especially mindful or needful or focused on preserving free will for God's ability to make choices that would to us maybe otherwise seem to be evil. Ockham says this against Platonic realism. If universals have real existence, it would follow that God would not be able to annihilate one individual substance without destroying the other individuals of the same kind. For if he were to annihilate one individual, he would destroy the whole that is essentially that individual, and consequently, he would destroy the universal that is in it and in others of the same essence. So in order to fully wipe out somebody that is participating in some kind of universal, actually multiple universals, God can't actually wipe them out if all of those universals that are in him remain. You'd have to wipe out the universals, and that would also have to wipe out everybody else that was participating in that. So other things of that same essence would not remain, for they could not continue to exist without the universal that constitutes that part of them. So universals would be a major limitation on God's will, according to Ockham. So in emphasizing God's omnipotence, Ockham argued that God might have made an infinite variety of worlds. Had it been God's will, it would have been possible to create a world where thou shalt kill was called good. So voluntarism in this way almost seems to demand that God exercise God's will with some degree of capriciousness in order to show that God acts freely. Nominalist and voluntarist theology, in my view anyway, have had significant results. So whereas Augustine and Aquinas gave theists an independent philosophical lens through which to discern God's expectations. So in other words, if we understand that God is good, God is love, God is justice, God is mercy, then by doing good, which is an actual universal thing, by loving, by being just, by being merciful, a person can innately participate in those universals which are God. By contrast, if God is not innately good because there is no universal good, but is only called good by convention or by definition, the sole path for the theist is to discern the divine will is revelation, which is to say, obedience to Scripture. And so thus any number of activities that may seem immoral or unethical, they could be justified because of one's particular interpretation of the Scripture. And so in my view, that I think has very dangerous results. And so this is the reason that even though this has not been a normal topic, we have been really, like I say, focused on historical topics, on biblical topics, and on some theology. I did want to do a little bit of a dive into this particular philosophical question, still an open question, a high stakes question, but one that has had some consequences for the development also of theology and some of the religious trends, and so some of the assumptions that some Christians and I think also some Muslims make, maybe also Jews. I know more about the tradition of this within Islam and within Christianity especially, based on this voluntarism. And so that is my take on the problem of universals. Okay, so let me first thank some people for their support. Brad Stewart, Mark Long, Jared, and Daryl Scott, we thank you so much. That really, again, your support helps us to be able to spend the time that's necessary to do all the reading and get ready for the different topics, and so I appreciate that. And I really enjoy being able to devote the time. Rain Weber asks, cold is relative. So how is coldness a thing? What is cold is compared to what, right? So it's some things is cold compared to some warmer thing, whereas if there's some colder thing, that would be relative, right? And likewise, size is relative, as are all things that lie on a spectrum: brightness, density, emotional temper. So why is good and evil different? So yeah, there isn't necessarily have to be different. So one of the, like I say, this is an open philosophical question. So on the one hand, to have a spectrum of those things doesn't necessarily mean that there's no universals. It can mean you're still participating in, you could still be participating in a universal quality without even though there is a competing quality. So this is a point. So relativism is one of the consequences of the sophists, and it is certainly more associated with therefore the nominalist side of this than the realist side of it. In a term, but essentially there would be a spectrum for good and evil. So how do Platonists deal with that for good and evil? So the solution is that evil is not in fact a thing. Good is the universal, and evil is the absence of having that universal of good. And so the spectrum of good to evil is how much do you fully have and are fully approaching the complete universal that is good, and how much are you so far apart from it that you have the total absence of that which is evil. And so that would be how it's described or explained. Certainly that would be Augustine's solution. It's the Neoplatonist solution for that. But you can also make the argument that everything is all just relative. That's certainly an open open philosophical position. The ultimate problem with saying everything is relative, that there is no intrinsic truth, is that it relies on you making a positive statement. Everything's relative. That statement also is ungrounded, because it is logically contradicts itself in that way. So Josh Bedford says, in the case of the orange, can't we just say that the concept orange is an internal perception in the mind that correlates with the brain's response to particular light frequencies? So yes, we can. So that is one of the answers about the concept orange. And so there is I think that in that case, what you're kind of saying is there's I think that you could possibly have a soft realism position with that, or a nominalist position with that. So if it's only in your mind as an internal perception, that's going to be nominalist. If that light frequency because it's going to be all identical, and it is part of the material form that is existing. You could have a soft realism that allows you to square that, is what I would think. But it's also potentially just, you could say that as a nominalist position, is something that only exists as a generalization in our mind, and it doesn't really correspond universally to anything. It's just each particular thing, we generalize it because we see it at that moment and we call it orange. Philip Denoto, thank you so much for your support. Daryl Scott says, is it contradictory to be a nominalist but to believe in a God that is essentially a Platonic form, eternal, universal, immaterial, and unchanging? No, I don't think that that's contradictory. That may be it may well be, so William of Ockham is a very devout Christian who believes in God. So unchanging, let's say immaterial, unchanging. I mean, I know that all of those ideas about God are very central to the pre-Ockham. I'd have to see what Ockham has to say about immaterial and unchanging, but I don't think that it's necessarily contradictory, because you don't have to believe in universals necessarily to believe in one universal infinite being that is apart from creation. You don't have to need all the other universals potentially. So I think you're probably fine with that, Daryl. We'd have to look into it. J.R. Exner says, so does Aristotle accept that a form of the good could exist without matter? No, I don't think so. So what he would see as, he doesn't have forms that are existing without matter. So things to have existence for Aristotle is a form that is mixed with matter. And so this is actually a component of Aristotle's soft realism that lots of people historically haven't liked the theological or philosophical implications for Plato's idea of the soul. So part of Plato's spiritualism is his idea that the mind and your will and all of those things are actually grounded in your soul, which is equated with, again, this immaterial, unchanging, immortal part of yourself. Whereas Aristotle is dubious that there's a part of you that can function without the body, the material, the brain, and all the other matter you have. And so you have to have the form and the matter mixed together for Aristotle, which cuts out, life after death, reincarnation, or a life in a Platonic heaven. Aristotle is dubious of those things as well. So, so I do think that that's I don't think that Aristotle would recognize that. So did he recognize thought as a form mixed with matter? So I think that what he was saying here is that if we're going to have something that is a purely, let's say, a mathematical idea like geometry, like Plato's dealing with, that those ideas are, that I think those don't have perhaps real existence, metaphysical existence for Aristotle, because you need to actually make something in order for it to have a form. Filippo Denoto, my mind keeps flashing to the Sufi Muslim philosophy of the unity of being as perhaps coming at the problem from another direction. I'm curious if anyone else is making that connection. Yeah, so it'd be interesting if people are making that connection. So the mainstream of Muslim theology went heavily in that voluntarist direction, I think. But there is always in all of the world religions, there's always a mystic approach that occurs. That is maybe a countervailing trend. So the Sufism is a is a mystical path, and that also exists in Christianity too. And so in some cases, those have people who are philosophically trained who are also making that kind of mystic argument. And so an example of that that we didn't get to read from is Bonaventure, who is more Platonist than some of the other contemporaries like Anselm, who are more Aristotelian. And so when that Platonist direction is also really where some of this mysticism resonates with, which is why the Gnostics are very influenced by that, by Platonism. Winston Barquez says, how did Aquinas and Augustine differ in treating the problem, I guess, of universals on the basis of realism? Ugh, that's a very detailed question. I need to have to do a direct comparison between Aquinas and Augustine. I would have to, unfortunately, have the text in front of me of how each of them is formulating their solution to the problem of universals. I mean, obviously, Augustine is more the Platonist, right? And so he has heavily absorbed Neoplatonism, and that's informing his thoughts. And then Aquinas is very much trying to bring the newly recovered Aristotle safely within the Christian fold and tradition, and successfully does that. And so they're both making syntheses, but Aquinas is going to be a more Aristotelian one, and so I think he's probably going to have a more moderate realism than Augustine's, which is going to be a more spiritual, or more fully, more, what do you ever call, not moderate realism, more extreme realism. Sandra Byrne says, I want to know how John got through saying podiumness without cracking, without cracking up. Yeah, so I don't know. I was definitely thinking about, like how, my podium here has the material, cause of podiumness, but it is actually made, or the formal cause of podiumness, but it is made out of the material that is wood. Is that it? Oh, this name is actually not Socrates. Yeah. Oh, okay. You have a person who is not Socrates who's saying, without God, what baseline for good is there if it is up to whomever decides it? So it is. So if we're understanding God as defined in the Western philosophical tradition as like the form of the good, as opposed to, we're not talking about God as just thinking about like an embodied or anthropomorphic idea. But if we're thinking about it instead of God, defining God as good, rejecting a universal or the idea of good, and in favor of a kind of relativism, does mean it's more difficult to make those arguments. And so one of the stakes of this question is, do we believe, for example, there is something like such a thing as fundamental human rights? Well, what makes certain things universal if there's no universals? So one of the things that when we abandon, even though there's all kinds of these metaphysical and ontological logical problems in trying to have universals, when we get rid of them, it is hard for us to justify universal categories or saying that this is a fundamental or anything like that. It's actually logically all a particular, or it's all relative, or it's an arbitrary convention. Is possibly what you end up with. Mary Magnuson says, did Plato's idea of the soul come from the emerald tablets? Was he exposed to these teachings? Not to my awareness. No, I don't think that. I'm not. So no, there's no sense that that's where Plato is coming from. So Plato has his ideas are from the immediate context of Socrates and then the pre-Socratic philosophers and he's especially influenced, for example, by Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, but he is not, not from emerald tablets. So Rain Weber says, oh, John Hamer, will you please do a deep dive on Diogenes Laertes, pretty please. So another fan of a different Diogenes. So maybe we'll have a lecture, who was Diogenes? And then we'll have to find out which Diogenes I'm going to be talking about. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. When we do these, like I say, we call these history, theology, philosophy lectures, and in order, that's where I'm most comfortable with. So I'm most comfortable with history, then I'm a little less comfortable with theology, and I'm least comfortable with philosophy, but I'm very interested in this topic. And so when I have to do the reading and the research in order to put one of these together, it's a lot of fun for me. And hopefully you also have found this enjoyable and useful. So thanks very much. Remember that next week, Brian will be here and he will be arguing that we're all Protestants.